What's up, my people? Welcome to Fellowship Bible Church's Sermon Spotlight, where we're coming at to you each and every week with a fresh weekend to debrief in an effort to send biblical truth. And what better way to do that than by the power of conversation? And I'm Rose Lauck, and I'm here today to host, which is kind of an unusual seat for me. And I have with me Mr. Cole McQuaid.
Hello, good to be back.
Mr. Mark Carey. And it's nice to have you back, Mark.
Thank you.
I at least have been aware that you've been absent and missed you very much. How many weeks were you gone?
4.
4?
Yeah.
Okay. That's a long time.
It's a long time to be away.
It is.
Yeah.
You did seem rejuvenated this weekend after being away from the pulpit for so long.
Yeah.
I could tell that you were rejuvenated. You had a lot of energy.
Oh,
And
good.
I was very engaged the entire time. I enjoyed your sermon. So
Well,
I could tell you were
good.
rejuvenated. I'm glad you had a good trip.
That's what Italian pasta and Greek baklava will do to you.
That's not what Italian pasta does to me. It messes me up. So I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Well, I was going to ask you guys to introduce yourselves and say what your Thanksgiving plans are, because you started your sermon with what not to talk about at Thanksgiving dinner. So who will you be with on Thanksgiving, Cole?
So my family goes to visit my dad's relatives every year in New Jersey. It's been a tradition my entire life. So we'll be up in northern New Jersey. That's where we go. We have
So
a good
we've
time.
gone like Wednesday through Sunday, or just you go for a couple days?
Yeah, we go for a couple of days. It's usually the same each year. We have the same traditions. We have the same like lunch plans, and then there's a meal every day. That's kind of how we do it. And in New Jersey, there's a meal on Thanksgiving, then there's a Black Friday meal, and then there's a breakfast on the Saturday. So
Nice.
it all revolves around food. It's fantastic. It's
That's
great. And there's a lot
good
of
conversation.
yes. Well, there's obviously drama because my dad is half Irish and half Italian. So can you only imagine what the chemistry with those genetics is in New Jersey of all places?
So
It's fun.
any topics of conversation you avoid, or any topics of conversation you always engage in?
I think that for me, I don't usually have to avoid too much, which is good. I do remember in 2016, the first time Trump was running for president, it got a little bit spicy. But other than that, it's been pretty tame.
How about you, Mr. Carey? What are your Thanksgiving plans?
Well, actually, for the first time in many, many, many years, our plans are still in flux. So
You don't know.
I do not know.
It's like 10 days away and you have no idea.
No idea.
Wow.
Kids are going, all our kids are here and grandkids, but there's in-laws and stuff and all going. We have a daughter. Our youngest daughter is waiting to give birth to child number 3. So that's going to pop anytime. We just don't.
yeah. So any topics of conversation that you will avoid or that you will engage in, or
Well, if it's just me, I love to talk to myself. and I always find that enlightening.
To talk to yourself.
Sure.
yeah. So I just asked that because that's kind of where you started your sermon, right?
Right.
With the 15 things that you should.
Rose, what are you doing for
What am I
Thanksgiving?
doing for Thanksgiving?
You can share.
I'm supposed to ask the question. My daughter and her family will come, so we'll have a delightful day on Thanksgiving. It's one of my favorite days of the whole year because it's a day that I don't usually work outside of my home. So we'll, cook and make crafts and watch, of course, the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. That's something I've done every Thanksgiving since I was a child.
It's a good
And so,
tradition.
Of course, we'll watch the parade. And I love parades. That's one of the things many people know about me. I love Apple Blossom. I love the Fireman's Parade. I go to every parade I can possibly participate in. I go. So that will be my plan. So we are reviewing a sermon that was on Mark chapter 10, verses 1 through 12, and it was about a thorny subject. So I just thought it'd be interesting before we dive in. I know, Mark, you have told us all that you have some things you want to talk about that specific thorny subject, but I just thought because the rest of us are often engaged with people of the world, maybe there are some other thorny subjects we can think of that we've had to engage with and how to engage with those. So Cole, you're a teacher in the public school, so I'm sure there are many subjects you would say are thorny. So can you give us some examples of some thorny subjects you feel like you've had to engage or that you think are really are really current in our culture?
I think
right
that
now?
especially in the public school system, thankfully in Frederick County, it hasn't been as big of a central point, but I think in neighboring school divisions, there's been a central focus on gender identity and teachers and parents' roles in that. Many people who work in the public school system want to have that voice to speak into that child's, into a personal identity when a lot of people, myself included, would say that it's more the responsibility of the parents to raise the child. So that is a very thorny subject specifically. And I think that is probably the biggest one. Thankfully, within my line of work, I don't have to discuss that too much. I think other than that, obviously politics. I think politics are going to differ, especially when you work in the public sector.
How about issues like the holidays, for example, like the celebrating of Christmas or other religious holidays? Are those
It really
thorny
depends on
issues anymore, or are those?
It depends on the school, to be completely honest with you. I think that a lot of the schools that I'm at, they try to celebrate as many holidays as possible, understanding that there are kids that celebrate different holidays. But at the same time, a lot of schools do recognize that most of the students in this area are going to be celebrating Christmas. So they're able to focus on that where needed. I mean, just the elementary schools I'm at are at different ends of the county in different neighborhoods. So they're very different demographics too.
Interesting. So how do you go about as a believer stepping into some of those thorny issues, like in your classroom and with your parents? And
I think it's important for me to remember that even though I'm working in the public school system and I am a voice for the curriculum and for the state, I'm also a voice for Christ. There are things that I'm not supposed to talk about, but if students ask me questions, I'm always able to answer them. So that's always my favorite. I've had students, not necessarily this year, but when I was still in the 5th grade setting, I've had students ask me a little bit about religion or my faith, and I'm able to answer them candidly, which is always very encouraging. So I think what I can do, and I think anyone who's working in the public sector in a secular setting, they can pray for those opportunities to arise, because we don't always have the opportunity to initiate those conversations freely, but we can always answer to the questions that people ask us.
so, Mark, I know this is kind of a deep question, and I'm asking you to answer it like on short notice. But like you mentioned things like
15 seconds.
Well, you mentioned sanctity of life. You mentioned an opinion about Israel or the plight of the Palestinians. You mentioned LGBTQ issues. You mentioned those are kind of the 3 hot buttons that you mentioned. So do you have examples maybe of ways that we as believers could begin to engage those topics in scripturally biblical ways? Like I'll just, for example, I think like immediately we talked about sanctity of life and even LGBTQ and other identity issues. And I went to Psalm 139, right? So as a believer, the idea that God knit us together and knew us before we were born, to me, speaks to those issues. So do you have other scriptural passages that you would just recommend that people dive into as they're looking at some of those identity or right to life issues,
Well, it depends who your audience is.
Yeah.
I wouldn't open the Bible necessarily right away and go to Psalm 139.
Right.
If the people I'm engaging in the conversation aren't believers or are, in a secular environment. I think our world is increasingly secular, and that even creeps very much into the so-called Christian community, the secularization of our church and our mindset of our world today, a worldview. So I wouldn't necessarily go to anywhere in the scripture. I think the wisest thing is you ask questions. If the topic comes up around the Thanksgiving dinner table, I think it's simple to say, that's an interesting comment that you just made. Tell me more about it. How did you explain what you mean by that? So Greg Kokel is a Christian apologist and has a ministry out in California called Stand to Reason. And he wrote a book a number of years ago that's been updated called Tactics, about how to engage the world in these type of things, these type of conversations. And he mentions that you'd always talk about, ask questions for meaning. So you want clarity. What did you mean by that? Well, I think, as someone might say, I think the woman has any right she wants to choose. It's her own body. So instead of jumping to a declarative statement, go to an interrogative. Tell me what you mean by that. Explain what you mean by her own body. It is what's in her womb like a sore tooth that needs to be pulled, or maybe an appendix that is inflamed, or what do you mean by her own body? You ask questions. You try to understand what they're saying and what they mean by that. And oftentimes they're just reciting some mantra. But
they read something they read somewhere.
Well, yeah, yeah. And then you want to ask questions. kind of parrot that meaning. Oh, this is what I understood you said. That's very interesting. I think I understand what you're meaning, what you said by that.
It's validating that they understand you're listening to them,
Yeah.
and you're not just throwing your own opinion at them without hearing them out.
Yeah, and you want to make sure you're going to address the right question, so you're not getting off on no, that's not what I meant. And then second of all, so there's questions for meaning, and then ask questions for validation. Like I think I understand where you're coming from in that. How did you come to that conclusion? Upon what basis do you find that is a reasonable conclusion? I just want to know how you validated that. Upon what basis? So you're asking questions. So I think it's important to be more interrogative than declarative, depending on the setting. But even in Christian settings, I think we are too quick to throw out our opinions and even biblical opinions or throw Bible verses at people. I would encourage people, don't do that until you've built a relationship, you've got some type of discipleship relationship, and then say, hey, would you be willing to meet and get together? Let's talk more about that and enter into it. The day was maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago that you could throw a Bible verse out and yeah, but what do you do with the Bible? And that type of thing. But we are so far beyond that today, I think, in our culture today, that we have to be wise as serpents, harmless as doves, and ask questions and keep asking questions, and then over time build that relationship. Now, if it's a spur of the moment thing, and you feel like it's a passing comment, I mean, you can still ask questions. Our goal should not be necessarily to convert people every time we have a conversation. You're sitting on an airplane, you have a 2-hour plane ride, you might maybe only have a 15-minute conversation. God's sovereign. Oh, if we're planting some seeds, be content with that, and know that God is sovereign, and He's going to, He's not up there biting His fingernails whether that person's going to get saved or not. He's got a plan, and He's sovereign. So we plant some seeds with good questions, let it go, and in heaven we'll find out who picked it up and later and continue that conversation. It takes all the pressure off. You can have wonderful and lively, but wonderful conversations if we just learn how to ask questions.
I know that in my field of education, if you want to deepen and broaden your understanding of something, it starts with asking good questions. Not just any questions, but good questions. Questions that allow someone to think in a complex way and in a deeper way. I think a lot of rich instruction starts with the teacher intentionally planning what questions they're going to ask their students. Yes, you're going to come up with questions during a lesson or during a conversation, but I think planning what questions you are going to ask might be necessary for a lot of people who are going to have difficult conversations.
Yeah. So let's talk about, I'm sorry.
Well, here a few weeks ago, we're walking in ancient Athens, the very street that Socrates walked and kind of discipled his student Plato, and he asked questions. And he wasn't in a classroom, wasn't with a whiteboard and or an overhead projector or what, he was right there in the city square, in the agora, in the street, talking with his students. And that whole Socratic, that's where we get that idea of asking questions, is probably the best educational model you can come up with.
So I was going to just ask a question, which is that you told us all on Sunday that you were going to spend this time unpacking this particular thorny issue about divorce.
Well, I said I was going to unpack Deuteronomy 24. So that's all I'm going to do.
Okay. Well, we would love to hear your thoughts on Deuteronomy 24.
We would.
Well, if
we're ready.
Yeah, if you go back to that Mark passage, Mark records that the Pharisees had come to Jesus, and there was an intentional attempt to entrap him with this issue.
This isn't the first time they've attempted to do that.
Oh,
they've done it with different issues.
That's right.
So this is a pattern for them.
This is their MO. And so, Jesus comes back and said, what did Moses command you? And it's interesting, Matthew's account of this is very similar. It's the same issue. Matthew has you read both the passages and you get the full picture of how the conversation actually went down, because this is a trap because they knew Jesus, they knew his answer, and in their understanding, Jesus's answer collided with the Mosaic law, and and so in the Matthew account, they ask Jesus, and he answers, but God has joined together, let no man separate. The two become one flesh. They come back with their question, why then did Moses command a certificate of divorce? And then he comes back and comes back with that's not what Moses commanded. He permitted that, but he commanded something else, which tips us off to the fact that they were misinterpreting the Deuteronomy 24 passage, which was they thought the genius of their trap.
Mm-hmm.
So we go to the Deuteronomy 24 passage, and it's one of these 4 verses are if this, then this. There's a protasis. If this happens, then the apodosis. Your conclusion is this. So that's how this is laid out in the Hebrew text. When a man takes a wife, marries her, happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her. This is Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. And so he takes a wife. She finds no favor because he has found some indecency or uncleanness in her. And then he writes her a certificate, a bill of divorce, and he puts it in her hand, and he sets her out of her house. And verse 2, she leaves his house and goes, becomes another man's wife. And if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then, now that, and actually if you have a King James version, I believe the King James is wrong on that, because they put the apodosis back up in verse 1, clear up the very beginning, but it's not there. So if this and this and this and this and this happens, then her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her back again.
So the word "and" becomes very important. It's not an or a but. It's an and.
Right. Yeah. So it's the Moses is making his case. You're doing this and this and this and this happens. Well, then, and what Jesus said, well, what did Moses command? In this passage, Deuteronomy 24, what Moses commanded is that verse 4, her former husband then who sent her away is not allowed to take her back again. But that's an abomination. So the Pharisees are coming, and they know that Jesus is teaching that the permanence of marriage, the indissolubility of the marriage union. But they think he's in contradiction to this Mosaic passage, because Moses, they thought, gave a command to write a certificate of divorce. And Jesus said, Moses didn't command that. He permitted that because of the hardness of your heart. But what he commanded is you can't remarry that first husband again. And then he basically says, but let me tell you what Moses really commanded. And then he goes back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2. So I think there's the flow of the passage has to, in the Deuteronomy 24 passage, Moses wrote that because to write that certificate of divorce proved that divorce had taken place, and that woman, the command was that she cannot go and be remarried again to that first former husband. And the Pharisees' trap was based on a misinterpretation of this passage. I mean, if they were right, it was a great trap, because they would have shown Jesus was in contradiction to Moses. But Jesus turned the tables and showed he wasn't in contradiction to Moses, if you understand that passage. There's some other things in that Deuteronomy 24 passage that I think is important. It's centers around that word in verse 1, some indecency or uncleanness. And you got to get a concordance and do a little word study on that. There are 3 distinct situations that are recorded in the Mosaic Law that I think have to do with this whole situation of breakup of marriage. Two of them have to do with adulterous, sinful relationships, and the consequence is stoning. That was what the consequence was stoning. The third was this, predominantly found in Leviticus 18. So that use of that word indecency is found, I think, 18 times or a whole bunch of times in Leviticus chapter 18. So they basically have to do with marriages that were marriages of near relatives. You just have to go read the passage, but Leviticus chapter 18, just weird things where you married your sister's whatever, just some aberrant relationships. And that would be indecent and unclean. And that marriage was supposed to end.
Well, I do have to say I was slightly confused because the story did come to my mind of the of them bringing to Jesus the woman who had been caught in adultery, right? And them saying that the punishment that the law would prescribe would be that she be stoned to death. And so as you were talking about this passage, that question actually came to my mind because, well, like why the whole certificate of divorce thing if the law already said that she should be stoned? So
Right.
That kind of became a moot point if you're obeying the law, because you mentioned those two rabbis who had the disparaging, like
Hillel and Shammai.
disparaging opinions on that.
Yeah.
So,
Now, in the first century, in Jesus' day, my understanding is the Roman law did not permit capital punishment outside their jurisdiction. I mean, their confine, their responsibility and authority. So that would probably have been out of the hands of the Pharisees at the time, although they did it to Stephen and killed him by stoning. The other interesting thing, you think of the story that's coming up at Christmas time, Mary and Joseph finds out that Mary's pregnant. And it says, being a righteous man, he sought to put her away secretly, quietly. Now, in that context, they were betrothed. In essence, they were married. It was a betrothal period for about a year, I think it is, and then it was consummated. In order to break that betrothal period, Joseph would have written a certificate of divorce. And he wasn't going to stone her. But obviously, everybody would have concluded she had sinned. And so he sought to put her away. And some would conclude that might have been also in mind here at the Deuteronomy 24 passage, because it says Joseph was a righteous man, and that's what he sought to do. One other thing I think is very interesting is in Acts, and I didn't intend to say all this, but in Acts chapter 15, after the Jerusalem council met, and you recall that was mainly over should the Gentiles undergo circumcision in order to get saved?
mm-hmm.
And that was the whole debate at the Jerusalem council. And that was hammered out and dealt with. But they concluded that James says in verse 19, therefore, it is my judgment that we do not trouble those who are turning to God from among the Gentiles, but that we write to them that they. So he made a concession here. That was a big problem in the early church. It was a conflict between the Jews and the Gentiles. Gentiles getting saved, coming into the church, and it was just abhorrent to the Jews. And so just out of sensitivity to the Jewish people, they write in verse 20 that, look, Gentiles, you get saved by grace through faith. It's free. No, you don't have to do anything to get to heaven. However, we want you to abstain from things contaminated by idols. That was abhorrent to Jews. No big deal to the Gentiles. Get a good piece of meat down at the meat market. Shoot, dang, that'd be great. But the Jews didn't like that. So abstain from things contaminated by idols, from fornication. It's the word porneia. and from what is strangled, and from blood. 4 things: meat contaminated by idols, fornication, from what is strangled, and from blood. Well, 3 of those things are real Jewish-oriented things from the law. Well, so is the word fornication in this context. He's talking about the Leviticus 18 things. I mean, of course you should abstain from fornication in the way we understand that term. But they're writing in a Jewish context, as was Matthew. So when Matthew talks in chapter 19, I don't want you to divorce except in the case of porneia. There's an exception clause that goes back to the Leviticus 18 laws that were specifically regulated to Jews, and that's what James is bringing out here. So there's a whole class that could be taught on this.
Right.
So I just wanted to summarize that. Basically, here's the point. The Pharisees were attempting to entrap Jesus based on a total misinterpretation of Deuteronomy 20. Jesus had the right interpretation. And if we go to that, you can see that there's 3 verses of if this, and this, and this, and this happens, then you do this. That's where the command was that Moses wrote in the Deuteronomy 24. They thought it was the command to write the certificate of divorce.
And I certainly understand why you didn't have time to unpack all of this on Sunday and would delay it until now. I'd just like to shift our focus of conversation just a little bit to what you did really call us as an application and this idea of the hardness of our hearts. And I've really been thinking on that. And as you were talking about it, I wrote like a lot of questions related to what does a hard heart look like? How do we as believers prevent our hearts from becoming hard? How do we identify things like hardness in our own heart? So I'm going to just throw it to you, Cole, and see if there were any other questions that came to your mind as he was discussing hardness of hearts. And
I think it's important for us, especially when we're tackling these challenging issues like divorce and the ones that we mentioned. I think a lot of time the hardness of our hearts as humans in this fleshly earth suit, as you've pinned them before, I think that's the central theme of these complicated issues is the hardness of our hearts. I think when we look at the Psalms, we really get to see how David, in many of the Psalms that he wrote, was striving for that heart after God. How can I conform my heart or allow the Lord to conform my heart so that I am more like him? I would say that a hard heart is one that isn't willing to change, that isn't moldable. And I think that is the issue. We don't want to change. We want to be comfortable. And Jesus is not calling us to live comfortably. He's calling us to live a life that is moldable so that he can mold us into his likeness. And when we run into these sticky issues, it's because we want things to be our way, because we think we know it's better. And I'm guilty of that. There are things that I get frustrated by when like I have this opinion and I think, why in the world, why does scripture say this? That feels so heartless. But then at the same time, I have to realize I'm looking at it through my own lens. I'm not looking at it through the lens of Christ, the one who died for me and for the world so that we might have an eternal relationship with him. I might not understand it fully. And that comes back to the fact that I'm in an earth suit and I'm not going to fully understand everything. I have to be moldable so that I can be changed, so that I can understand better.
Yeah, I like the word teachable.
Right.
Or we could go back to the word that we use around here a lot, which is becoming a disciple, right?
Right.
Because a disciple is a student, someone who's learning to be more like Christ, you know?
Yeah, I concur with what Cole is saying. Another way of maybe looking at that is my lack of willingness to be moldable comes down to my desire to want to hold on to my life, which comes down to pride, and so that I want what I want when I want it and what's best for me. And so again, what I was trying to do in the sermon is show how that passage in Mark 10 is in the middle of the positive of what is a soft heart. That's that servant-hearted. It was an example of Jesus, who actually divested himself of his self desires, you could say, and of his eternal glory, and stepped into the earth suit of a servant. He emptied himself.
It's that beautiful song in Philippians 2.
That's
And
right.
they say that it is a song. It is expressed in poetic form, because these words, when you start thinking about
That's right.
what Christ did, we almost can't say it in paragraphs and sentences. We have to say it in art, because just my desire of my heart would be to be like Jesus in that. But I think, and Cole, you used the words, and as you were even saying the words, I was like, these words seem easy to say, but the application of having that same attitude of Christ and putting others in front of ourselves,
Right.
and our ideas and opinions,
and that should, I mean, the place that should really shine, most say the brightest should be in the marriage relationship, because Jesus tied that back to creation. He made them male and female. For this cause they shall leave and cleave and become one flesh. What does Satan come in and attack? That very thing. And why did Eve succumb to that attack? Because instead of seeing herself in a one flesh relationship with her husband, she all of a sudden started seeing herself alone. Yeah, that would be good to eat. Oh, that would make me wise. And she gave her the fruit to eat. Now, the question is, why would Adam take of it and eat? Was he just being, dull-witted?
A dingus.
Yeah. Here's something to ponder.
was he putting aside his own, I know he should have been the leader in that circumstance, but
why wasn't he? And here's something to ponder, is that he sees his wife, Eve, taking of that fruit to make herself wise. Now, we don't know when all that took place in the Garden of Eden, how long they had been together as a couple, and they, and all the, keeping the garden and doing their thing. In that idyllic type of setting, Adam had a wonderful gig going on. Here was this bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, this beautiful Eve, and they were this in harmonious relationship with God. And then all of a sudden, she goes off on her own. Was it possible that Adam thought, I'm going to lose all that, so I'm going to follow along? I don't want to lose what we have enjoyed, and so he pursued it. And I would suggest that what he did by taking and eating was equally as self-centered. That he was thinking in that moment, as Eve was thinking of herself, but she was deceived. Adam was thinking of himself, and he knowingly entered in, and it was self-centered hubris, pride. That's at the center of a hard heart, because I want what I want. And the opposite of that is Christ-likeness and putting that little child in the middle. You by the way, and this is kind of an aside, but you read a passage like we did in that message Sunday. There's two things that could have been said. I didn't have time, and it wasn't the point of the passage necessarily, but I think it's important to say that if someone finds himself in an abusive relationship, in a marriage relationship, they need to get out of that abusive. They need to separate themselves from that.
Absolutely.
And our soul care team, our counseling team, has put together a wonderful kind of a strategy and a policy of abuse that the elders have approved, and it's very important that be heard. Second of all, and Cole, you can maybe speak to this. What about the single adult, and where does that come in? And I don't know.
Right. I was going to ask about that, because in a passage you referenced in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, it does mention, and then in Matthew 19, the parallel passage to the one we studied in Mark, the disciples ask, well, if this is the case with marriage, isn't it best to just not get married at all? And that's when Jesus says, for the one who can accept this statement, they should. Yeah. And Paul says, I wish that all were as I am.
That's right.
So I think what happens is, unfortunately, those that are single, some are not at peace because they want to be in a relationship and aren't. I know a lot of people my age, especially young men, are not at peace when they are single. I am at peace right now being single, and I feel very blessed to be in that position. And that's something that's a prayer for all young men that are my age. Obviously, don't stop looking if that's something that you desire, but can you find peace and contentment? One thing that gives me peace is I have seen how the Lord is able to work in me because I am single in a way that maybe someone who is in a relationship and is using all of that time towards building that relationship, a godly one, they don't have as much time as I do.
Which is exactly what Paul meant in that 1
I
Corinthians
know.
7 passage.
And that's one reason why I have peace too. So that's just my prayer. If you are single, how can you use the time that God is giving you and the resources that God is giving you now to serve Him? Because there's a different type of service when someone is single. Kind of like
I
Paul.
think like the same is true. I think you just did a really great summary of Philippians 4, right? Where Paul talks about being content in your circumstances, whatever those circumstances are, married, single, plenty, want. In that passage, he's talking about economics, but the concept is the same, that God has sovereignly ordained our lives and has put us in the circumstances that He desires for us, and we can be content and trust Him in those circumstances.
But let me reiterate, as you would,
marriage,
that right, if you're in, and you have to define abuse and all that, what that means. We do that in our abuse policy, but you can still find contentment and be safe. And be removed in that. And it's not that we're advocating a divorce or thing.
Fellowship Bible Church has resources to help
That's
you
right.
if you're in those circumstances.
That's right.
And you definitely should discuss that with a pastor or our biblical soul care team so you can get the right help in the right places that you need, for sure. So I think that about wraps us up for our sermon spotlight today. There's just a few things coming up. Thanksgiving is on us. Christmas season is coming. Hanging of the Greens is
super fun time.
Yeah, really fun. And it is, I got a couple emails about people. Yes, bring your kids. This is intended to be an opportunity for families to worship the Lord together. And I have seen it. I've seen kids come to this event and help decorate a place and then watch them on Sunday morning as they come in and know that they were part of making this place beautiful, which helps them value the church.
That's right. It's a great way for families to be involved in something in the life of the church, and kids grow up with those memories and they realize, hey, I grew up in a fun church.
I hope so.
Yeah. And a couple things I know, I'm on the Follow the Star leadership team. They're looking for some scene narrators, so people to stand in one spot and tell the story between scenes. There's also a lot of food donations that they're looking for to feed the volunteers right now. So cookies and food donations, and if you want to speak. So see that sign-up table in the lobby.
And Scott Santmeyer had said at the FSAT service there was still a need for one more Mary. So I don't know.
There is. If you know someone who is 17 to 19 years old, we have one of the beginning Marys. We would definitely appreciate someone who's confident to speak and be in that story.
Good.
There's always ways to be part of the community here. And that's one of the things I love about Fellowship Bible Church. And again, the pastoral staff, the biblical soul care team, the amount of support they can give you as you face struggles or these other thorny issues that we've kind of brought up today. If you're seeking biblical wisdom on those things, there are tons of resources here to help you with that. So just want to tell our listeners and viewers to remember that we like to hear from you. We want to answer your questions. These shouldn't be just our questions. You can send over your thoughts, questions, or requests to fbcva.org podcasts, and you can write notes or comments there. Be sure to check out the other two Fellowship Bible Church podcasts, the Fellowship Family and the Global Church, and they are really good. I enjoy listening to them and learning so much from them. The fact of the matter is, everybody, that sermons are not meant to take an hour, but to transform a lifetime. Until next week, much love and God bless.